Next, we have Professor Klarman from the Harvard Law School.
At the law school, we have a lecture series that's similar to this one, but it's entitled Last Lectures. I always found that a little bit foreboding, as in last lecture before I drop dead. So I actually prefer this lecture series a lot better, lectures that last. My talk today is going to be similar to one that I gave a few years ago at the law school, but there's one big difference. The difference is when I gave this before, it was the pre-Trump era, and frankly, it was a time that I think people would have thought the idea of a President Trump as vaguely ridiculous. But now that I give the lecture today, I intend it as an expression of hope and resilience. When I gave it before, it was an expression of admiration for some civil rights lawyers who I revered. Now it's an expression of hope and resilience in a terrifying and bleak landscape in which our nation's democracy, I believe, is very much under threat from somebody who is the most unprepared, reckless, temperamentally unsuited, boorish, and dangerous persons ever to inhabit the White House. So I'm going to talk to you about a group of lawyers whom I find almost as inspirational as this year's New England Patriots. People like Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, Oliver Hill from the state of Virginia. I want to talk to you about some of the special difficulties that they faced in litigating for social change, for progressive racial change in the middle decades of the 20th century. I hope those stories will prove inspiring to you, especially those of you who are distraught by our current political predicament. My claim is that these people face much greater obstacles than anybody who's unhappy about the political status quo today. So to begin, even the simple task of becoming a lawyer was very difficult for these people. The Southern Jim Crow system did not permit African Americans to become very well educated. Not a single Southern law school admitted African Americans until the 1950s. Even having overcome the barrier to becoming a lawyer, these people faced much greater difficulties than ordinary lawyers confront. One distinctive obstacle they faced was the threat and reality of physical violence. They were challenging a deeply entrenched system of white supremacy, something that white people were very attached to and were often prepared to use violence in order to hang on to. Not many years earlier, large numbers of blacks had been lynched every year in the South by whites, as many as 100 a year annually in the 1890s. Even as late as the middle of the 20th century, some African Americans engaged in civil rights protests were killed. Many others were maimed or beaten for what they were doing. For example, when World War II veteran Etoy Fletcher tried to register to vote in Mississippi, rural Rankin County, Mississippi in 1946, the registrar informed him, according to a letter that's preserved in the NAACP papers, that, quote, niggers are not allowed to vote in Rankin County, and if you don't want to get into serious trouble, get out of this building. While waiting for a bus to carry him out of town, Fletcher was assaulted by 4 whites who drove him several miles into the woods, beat and flogged him mercilessly, and warned him that he would be killed if he ever again tried to vote in Mississippi. Harry Moore, who was the NAACP's chief organizer in the state of Florida, was assassinated by a bomb planted under his home in Mims, Florida on Christmas night, 1951. That was in retaliation for his voting rights activity. Civil rights lawyers faced similar sorts of violence. Thurgood Marshall himself was nearly lynched in 1946 while representing black defendants who had been charged in connection with the Columbia, Tennessee race riot. NAACP lawyers in Nashville and Birmingham who were bringing school desegregation suits in the early 1960s had their homes bombed. Physical violence was not the only obstacle confronted by black lawyers litigating for civil rights. A black lawyer named Arthur Madison, who was suing to compel registrars in Montgomery County, Alabama, to enroll black voters in 1944, was arrested, convicted, and then summarily disbarred for representing his clients without authorization. What had happened was that the county sheriff had intimidated Madison's clients into withdrawing their consent to his representation. Then not a single white lawyer would represent him at his trial. What happened to Madison was actually a serious problem for black civil rights lawyers in general. Their work required them to walk a fine line around the ethical constraints that generally apply to lawyers. Those rules were first created with ordinary litigation in mind. They required lawyers not to foment litigation, not to financially support it, and not to take control of it. But organizations that were litigating for social reform often could not comply with those rules. For example, NAACP officials would go to a meeting of black teachers, inform them of their right, for example, their right to be paid the same as whites for performing similar work. Then they would ask somebody to volunteer as a plaintiff. Then they would set up an insurance fund because the person who volunteered would almost certainly be fired from their job. These sorts of NAACP activities risked violating the usual constraints on lawyers that prevent them from fomenting litigation or financially supporting it. It was enforcement of these sorts of ethical constraints that enabled many southern states to try to shut down the NAACP in the years after Brown versus Board of Education. Another problem black civil rights lawyers faced was the racial prejudice of judges and juries, all of whom were white in the South in the middle decades of the 20th century. When black NAACP lawyers argued a voting rights case before a federal circuit court in Texas in the early 1930s, the judges on the bench literally turned their backs on the lawyers as an expression of insult or humiliation. In correspondence with the NAACP's national office, the lawyers doubted whether it was even worth turning up for oral argument because they thought their only realistic chance for success was in the United States Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court wasn't always the most hospitable forum for them either. Justice James McReynolds literally turned his back on Charles Hamilton Houston when he argued an important case challenging higher education segregation from the state of Missouri in 1938. Charles Hamilton Houston was a graduate of Harvard Law School, a protege of Felix Frankfurter, and the dean of Howard Law School, yet Justice McReynolds turned his back on him when he was arguing the case. Another point to note about these path-breaking lawyers, in some ways the most important part of their job actually did not take place in the courtroom. These lawyers went into southern black communities and they tried to educate people, few of whom were aware of their constitutional rights, that they actually had rights that white people were bound to respect. These lawyers saw an important part of their job as mobilizing African American communities to fight against an oppressive status quo, encouraging them to believe that progressive racial change was actually possible, and boosting their morale by demonstrating that there was an outside organization that was inclined to help them and help them overcome obstacles, which at the time must have seemed often insurmountable. Houston, who was the NAACP's chief litigator for much of the 1930s, saw a principal goal of his litigation campaign as, quote, arousing and strengthening the will of local communities to demand and fight for their rights. Now, the NAACP also recognized the beneficial psychological effect that using black lawyers could have on the local black community. Southern blacks were not accustomed to seeing black people stand up for their rights among whites and to stand up on a footing of near equality with whites, but that was something they might be able to do in the courtroom. That's how Thurgood Marshall described what happened in a courtroom in Hugo, Oklahoma, a small town in 1941, when he was defending a black man named Lyons, who had been accused of murder, possibly on trumped-up charges. Lyons had been beaten into confessing a fact that Marshall was trying to get the white sheriff to admit on cross-examination. Marshall and his co-counsel, who was a white lawyer from the ACLU, had agreed that Marshall would cross-examine the police officers because, according to Marshall's written account, quote, we figured that they would resent being questioned by a Negro and would get angry, and this would help us. It worked perfect. They all became angry at the idea of a Negro pushing them into tight corners and making their lies so obvious. Boy, did I like that, and did the Negroes in the courtroom like it. You can't imagine what it means to those people down there who've been pushed around for years to know that there's an organization that will help them. They're really ready to do their part now. They are ready for anything. Moving on to my final point, one might think that the main difficulty confronting these lawyers was coming up with convincing legal arguments, but for black civil rights lawyers, that often was not enough. The system they were challenging was so fundamentally unjust that even a compelling legal argument might not win in court. One of the most important cases argued by Oliver Hill, who was the pioneering black civil rights lawyer in Virginia, was a case involving the Martinsville Seven. 7 young black men were charged with raping a white woman in Martinsville, Virginia in 1949. They were prosecuted, convicted, and then given the death penalty. Their trials were actually reasonably fair given the time and place. Unlike with many similar trials taking place in the South at this time, the Martinsville Seven had capable lawyers. They had a trial judge who tried to be fair. They had a trial that was not dominated by mob spirit and the threat of lynching, and they had not been beaten into confessing. There were only 2 problems with their trials and their death sentences. First of all, every one of the 72 jurors who sat in the 6 trials of the 7 defendants was white, and second, of the 45 men executed by the state of Virginia between 1908 and 1950 for the crime of rape, every single one was a black man accused of raping a white woman. The state could only get away with that result by making sure that blacks didn't sit on juries in these cases. Hill raised that claim in the Supreme Court. The claim is that racially disparate administration of the death penalty ought to be unconstitutional. It seems hard to deny the justice of that claim. If the state's not going to execute whites for the crime of rape, then it shouldn't be executing blacks for that crime either. That claim won in the Supreme Court 25 years later. It did not win in 1951. The Supreme Court refused even to grant review in the case of the Martinsville Seven, who were then executed by the state of Virginia, which was the largest mass execution or lynching for the crime of rape in American history. To conclude, black civil rights lawyers who are litigating for progressive racial change in the South face the threat of and reality of physical violence, they face the risk of legal sanctions for ethical violations, and they faced racially prejudiced judges and juries who rejected even compelling legal claims. Progressives today who fully appreciate the threat that Trump poses to American democracy and are committed to doing something about it, they face a relative walk in the park, a relative picnic. So you shouldn't be dispirited, you shouldn't be discouraged. You ought to be hopeful, but you also ought to be angry, you ought to be committed, and you ought to get to work. Your country and the cause of social justice requires you more than ever before. Thank you very much.